All right, we're working on exercise 9-1, work with dates and times. I have the application or the start files open, and if you look at page 310 in your book, you'll see what the goal is. When somebody enters a date here and clicks on calculate due dates, due days, it'll tell you how many days you have until this invoice is due or something like that. And then, so this date is in the future. And then if you enter in someone's birthday and click on calculate age, it will tell you how old this person is. So they're quite similar, they're related. We're going to work on the future date first and then really copy all that code to get the birthday, copy it and just switch directions of some things. So let's start, if someone puts in a future date and they click on calculate due date, I'm going to double click on that to start the event handler. And here we are. So we're ready to start working on calculating the due days. So the first thing we want to do is, and I'm going to go back to a code snippet. So KX, I want a code pattern, conditionals and loops. I just need an if and if. Pretty simple one. And what I'm searching for is if is date. You can use the isDate function and look at future date to see if what the user entered is actually a date. And this is where all my code's going to go, but what I really want to do is, I'll finish that up. Okay, so if the future date is a date, I need to create a variable. I'm going to create this variable called future date, and it is a date. And what we're going to do is we're going to store what the user entered into our future date variable as a date. However, we can't just take the string and shove it in there. We need to convert it to a date. So this isDate function is making sure that this is going to succeed. And then, if you look at, I forget what page it is in the book. Oh, this is it. About page 291. They'll show you how to do this in multiple steps, but really we can do a lot of things in one step here. So I need another variable that is, I'm going to call this days till due, and that's going to be an integer. And what I want to do with this is store the difference between the future date and today. And to do that, I'm going to use the dateDiff function. And the dateDiff, you see, it takes an interval, and then date 1, date 2. So my interval, I'm going to use dateinterval.day, because I want this difference in days. And my dates will be future date, and my other date, I'm just going to use today. So I think the book shows you to take today and store it in a variable, but I'm just, I don't want to have an extra variable floating around, so I'm just going to use the today, Visual Basic constant. So dateDiff, I'm getting an error here, returns a long, and it's trying to shove it into an integer. So I'm just going to take all that and run it through cint. And all right, that's it. So now I know how many days in the future my invoice is due. So I need to display that as shown as in step 2 of the exercise. They show the box what it should look like. So I'm going to make my message as a string is equal to nothing. And I'm going to say my message, I'm going to do ampersand equals to it. Current date, I'm going to tab over, the current date is today, add a new line, and then my message ampersand equals future date, and again I'm putting a tab in here to line things up nicely. So future date is a date, and I want to make this a string. So let's make sure our option strict turned on. It is, okay. So I'm going to specify the formatting of future date. So I'm going to hit tab here and write to, and you see all my options here. I want to make this to short date string. So this is allowing me to further format my date string. Okay, and then after this I just have a new line, and then I'm going to have days until due, tab over, and I'm going to put in here days till due. Now remember, days till due is an int, so I'm going to make it to string, and then message box.show my message, and they call this due days calculation. Alright, so let's see, if I run this, and I know it's not right, I just wanted to show you some things going on. Let's first, we're going to put in a date that's not a date. Hit calculate due dates, and it does nothing, which, you know, is okay. It doesn't crash, but it doesn't tell us anything useful. So instead here, what I want to do is I'm going to do messagebox.show. Actually, I'm going to put this in an else. Please enter a valid date. And then maybe we can even say here txt future date.text. So we're actually showing this is what you inputted is not a valid date. Please enter a valid date. The title of this message box is input error. We then select, move the focus to the future date box, and we select all. So now when I run this thing, I put junk in there, tells us that it's not a valid date, enter a valid one, and then we get this box. So we can come back and say, all right, my future date 5/15/2022, calculate due dates, shows me the current date, shows me the future date, days until due, negative 805. So I have my dates backwards. I want to, when I calculate the diff, I want to start with today as the first date, and then future date is the second date. So now when I run this, future date 5/15/2022, days until due 805. That works great. But if I made this, you know, 5/15/2018, days until due negative 656, because the future date is not a future date. So let's put something in there that makes sure that we want to make sure that this days until due is in the future. So if days until due is less than 0, then messagebox.show there we go. Messagebox.show, please enter a date in the future. And, you know, I'm going to run this. I know we're not done here. So if I do 5/15/2018, please enter a date in the future, but then it still does the calculation because I didn't put all of this stuff in an else. Alright, let's try this one more time. So if we put in something that's not a date, it tells us it's not a date and selects it for us. If I put in something that is in the past, it tells me to put a date in the future. And if I put a date in the future, it tells me the days until due. And today's March 1st, 2020. Let's do March 2nd, 2020, just to make sure. There you go. Now it's 1 day due. Let's see what happens if I choose today. It's due in 0 days. I'd say that's accurate. And then if I did yesterday, which happened to be leap day, it's going to tell me please enter a date in the future. And what's cool about this, so 2/29/2020 was a leap day. If I do 2/29/2021, it knows that it's not a valid date. So pretty cool. Our application works. I'm just not too happy with some of the code that I have this if and then this if and all these else statements. I mentioned before the idea of getting rid of else statements. So if you think about this, if is date text future date dot text. Really, if text future date dot text is not a date, let's do it that way. Let's say if not is date text future date dot text. Then we're going to say that it's not a valid date. Still select those things. Then I want to exit sub and end if. And then I can get rid of these down here. So if txt future date dot text is not a valid date, if not all this, then display the error message and then exit the sub procedure. All right, so already our code is a little bit cleaner. And I'm going to do the same thing here. If days until due date is, or days till due is less than 0, so you entered a date in the past, we're still going to show that message box, but all I'm going to do here is exit sub. All right, and by doing that, I can take my actual code that does stuff, does all these calculations, and I can put it outside here. And let's just throw some comments in here. So if the user's input is not a valid date, show error message and exit. Here, calculate the difference. Here, if user entered a date in the past, show error message and exit. And here we're going to build the message, and this is display the message. So this is, in my opinion, cleaner code that we're not indented multiple levels. It's quite simple here that if the user's input is not a valid date, we do this stuff and then we exit sub, and it doesn't even look at anything else here. Same thing here. Here's an exit sub because if days till due is less than 0, we get out of there. And then otherwise we build our message and display everything as usual. So this is our click event handler for the calculate due days button. Now we're going to do the same thing with calculate age, only we're going to flip it around. Meaning age has to be, when someone enters a birthday, it needs to be in the past, not in the future. So I'm going to copy this part and put it in here. And what we're looking at is text birthday. So already, if the birthday is wrong, show an error message and quit. Sounds good. Next I'm going to do, calculate the difference. So we have a variable, a date variable called birth date that holds the user's birth date. And we're going to call this days since birth. is an integer. Using the same thing, calculating the number of days starting with today, ending with the birthday. So I think I'm going to want to flip these around because we're taking the smaller number first. So now we know the number of days since this person's been born. We're probably going to do the same thing. If user entered a date in the future, show error message. So if days since birth is less than 0, enter a date in the past. So that's our error checking. And then otherwise we're going to build this message. Current date, birth date. So again, just a lot to copy and paste. This is days since birth to string. And we're going to call this age calculation. So a lot of copy and paste. Let's see what we get here. Birthday, I put junk in there. Great. Tells me it's not a valid date. That worked fine. If I put in some date in the future, go way in the future here. Tells me to enter a date in the past. And if I put a date in the past, well, okay, this still says days until due, so we want to change that. And 6,500, that's the number of days that the person has been alive. So we're going to switch this to say age. And instead of days, we want to know the person's age. So we can take the number of days since they've been born and divide it by 365, and that's the number of years that they've been born. We're going to take that. It's a double right now. I'm going to, actually I'll leave it a double. I'm going to call age a double. And I'm walking you through this process so you can see what's going on. So we calculate the person's age, and I just switched, I took this age variable and put it down here in my message. So now when I run my application, 5/15/20/2002, calculate age, this person is 17.8 years old, which is accurate. This is the number of years that this person's been born, or number of years this person's been alive, but that's not their age. If you're 17.8 years old, then your age is 17. If you're 17.99 years old, meaning tomorrow's your birthday, you're still 17. Tomorrow you'll be 18. We're going to play with that as well. So instead of figuring out your age just by the number of days divided by 365, we're going to use math.floor and pass that in. And math.floor will take, this will take 17.88 and it changes it to 17. It pretty much rounds down. So we'll say that. Rounds down. All right. And I'm going to add another tab in here because I want this thing to line up nicely, because I'm particular like that. 5/15/2002, calculate age, 17. Now, if you're watching this video, later, this is being calculated from 3/1/2020. So if you're not getting 17, and let's say it's June of 2020 or March of 2021 or even later than that, this number obviously will change as time goes on. So far so good. Let's look at this down to like a closer level though. So if somebody was born, let's say 2/20/2019, so just about a year ago, this individual would have, and actually I'm going to use 2/18 because that was my friend's daughter's birthday. I'm going to hit calculate age, and yep, she just turned 1. That makes sense. So what if she was born on February 28th of last year? 1. That still makes sense. What if she was born on 3/1 of last year? 1. She just turned 1 today. That makes sense. What about 3/2 of last year? Well, that's not right. And you can show this even further. 3/1 of like 2012, let's say. Actually, I guess I would want it like 2/29. Leap days throw this into, it gives you problems. Alright, so what you need to do is, if you think about how many days in a year there are, there's 365 days in a year, but also once every 4 years you have a leap day, which obviously once every 4 years is 0.25. So I'm going to change this calculation to 365.25. And even this isn't really accurate, but it's, I'm going to say, accurate enough for our calculations. So in this case, if the person's birthday is tomorrow, they're still 0. If the person's birthday is today, they're 1. If they were born, 3/1, 2000, it's their birthday today, they're 20 years old today. So this just gives you a more accurate count as to how old the individual is. And that was the second part of 9.1, and that's everything for 9.1 now.